Hey guys, welcome back to my channel, Contracts Unfolded. Most people think confidentiality clauses are simple. Don't disclose any confidential information and end of story. However, in reality, this particular clause decides who controls the information once it leaves your inbox. Because I have seen situations where even the parties were held responsible, even though the confidential information was not shared outside. Why? Because confidentiality clause is not just one clause, it is a part of different clauses interwoven together. So in this video, we will talk about the different components or the different aspects of a confidentiality clause. So the first component is the definition of confidential information. This definition tells us what is actually protected, and most contracts defines confidential information in a very broad terms. They say any non-public information will be considered confidential information, and it also covers all types of format, whether the information was disclosed in written form, whether it was disclosed in oral form, either in an electric form or some other visual form. Some clauses even require to mark the information as confidential information or label the information as confidential information. While I've also seen that no such requirement was asked by the disclosing party. The second component is the exclusions and the carve out from confidential information, because the confidential information can never be absolute. There have to be some exceptions to it, and this clause exactly, or this component exactly, talks about that. Some common exclusions can be information that is already in the public domain, or information which later came into the public domain without the breach of this agreement, information which was known to the receiving party, or the information which was compelled to disclose by any authority or by some law. Now, as I've said, confidentiality or confidential information cannot be absolute. Therefore, without these exclusions, the confidentiality becomes too much one-sided, and therefore it also becomes difficult to enforce. The third component is the purpose and the use restrictions of the confidential information. Now, most confidentiality clauses restricts the use of confidential information only for the purpose that was agreed in the agreement. Therefore, the confidentiality is not about the secrecy of the information, but it is also about the way you are going to use that information. And in light of this, even an internal use of that information can be called as breach. For example, using the client data for another project can be a breach of this agreement or this clause, even though the information was never shared outside. The next component is the permitted disclosure. And this clause answers a very practical question: who is allowed to use the confidential information? Usually, the clause says that the employees, the contractors, the subcontractors, the directors, the consultants, these people are allowed to see and use the confidential information. However, they are required to be bound by similar confidentiality obligations, and therefore you will see many companies, whenever they engage their employees on some particular projects, they ask their employees to sign NDAs. The next component is the confidentiality obligations, and this component actually defines the rights and duties of the receiving party. Typically, the receiving party must keep the information confidential, not disclose the information in public, and also have to take reasonable care to protect the information. Some clauses also require the receiving party to notify the disclosing party in case any breach of this confidentiality happens. The next component is about the duration and the survival of the confidential information. The reality is, confidential information does not end with the end or expiry of the contract, and this component tells exactly how long the obligations will last. Some clauses say 2 years, some clauses say 5 years, and even some clauses say infinite term. But in reality, the duration should always align with the nature and the secrecy of the information. Not every information can be held confidential for infinite time. However, for information such as trade secrets, infinite duration is not bad. The last component is the return of the confidential information or destruction of the confidential information. Because while working for the client, you must have made some copies of the confidential information, and therefore the disclosing party requires you to destroy all the copies that you have created or return all the copies or all the information that you have access to. I have also seen some disclosing party giving the right to retain copies to the receiving party for compliance or for some legal purposes. But then in such a case, your obligations should last till the time you are retaining such copies or records. So these were some of the key concepts of a confidential information clause. Once you will be able to identify or dissect the confidentiality clause into such components, drafting a confidentiality clause or reviewing a confidentiality clause will become much easier for you. And if you think this video was helpful, then consider subscribing this channel. I'll see you in the next video. Thanks. Take care. Bye.